Hello, this is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. This video will be still one more video of the genre, so to speak, of reading the philosophical text, or better to say, text from history of philosophy. And I will make a quick reference to my previous video about Heidegger, because this one should really be watched in conjunction with it, because I'm making it to make a point about Heidegger. My video about Heidegger was in fact about his methodological approach. It was reading of introduction into his Sein und Zeit. And my point was that Heidegger is anti-metaphysical thinker, that he is very destructive towards what is traditionally considered to be metaphysics, although for some reason he is considered to be opposite, like a kind of traditionalist, of a man who tried, let's say, single-handedly in 20th century to rescue the metaphysics through posing the question of being. Well, not to be not to expect anybody to take my word for it. I will compare in very as short as I can, short terms as I can, Heidegger with a true metaphysician, and this metaphysician is a Plotinus, or Plotin as we call him in Croatia, nominally Roman Neoplatonic, great Neoplatonic pagan philosopher of the late antiquity, although Plotinus was, by all reckoning, originally an Egyptian by ethnicity. And he is the founder, he is considered to be a founder of what is called Neoplatonism. I will not go too deep into beating around the bush with these general statements on Plotinus and his Enneads, from which I will read, to be more precise, from the volume 3, essay 7 on eternity and time, which can be read as original that Heidegger inverts. Not intentionally, probably, I'm not even sure. Have Heidegger ever read this? Probably was, but he didn't deem it very important to his misadvantage. What Plotinus does is complete opposite of what Heidegger does. Although on superficial level it can really seem to be resembling one another's approach. And this is something I want to do now. I'll just say that Plotinus Enneads, these writings on Plotinus, are 6 volumes separated into 9 sections. Each and every section represents one Plotinus's essays. Some of those essays make a bigger whole. That is, you have 3 essays, for instance, on soul or on spirit and so on and so forth, and they were published and edited by his student Porphyrius, also extremely important philosopher, extremely important for Middle Ages, and Plotinus himself was extremely important later, both for theology of Christianity, even in Islam and so forth. I will try to refrain from criticism. That is, better to say, not criticism, but trying to point out nuances from which on which Christianity worked in this theological thought, and which Plotin never developed, because one could argue that this appropriation of some of those Neoplatonic, Platonic notions was not really a criticism so much as they are so natural for theological thinking that when you're trying to think in terms of metaphysics, in terms of theology, you kind of have to use them. They are the best, the most natural methodological form but Christianity is, of course, something different. And there is this strain of Renaissance science Platonism. I don't consider that to be Platonism at all, especially this of Plotinus's kind. And maybe I'll get back to that just to point out some interesting things in Plotinus. What I want here is to do what I already done with Heidegger, to demonstrate to you the peculiar way of doing philosophy, of philosophical activity, what the philosophy is. That is the method, that is the road the thinking takes when it is on the path of going into philosophy. And this is something that is essential, and this is a step that is, especially in our postmodern times, let's call it like that, completely neglected. And there are people who write volumes of books and never accomplish this simple step of really going into a problem by activity of intellect. So without further ado, on eternity and time is a Plotin's discourse or a treatise investigating the nature of eternity and time. At the outset, aion kai chronos, chronu. I know these are declensions. Ainos kai chronu. About periainos kai chronu. Aion is eternity, and chronos, of course, is a time. Now, we will quote some passages. We won't go through whole essay. We will skip a lot of some substantial insights of Plotinus for the sake of relative brevity, but I do encourage you to try, if you can get your hands especially on this Armstrong's, Arthur Hilary Armstrong's classical translation published in library, and read Plotinus yourself. So, let's see what Plotin has to say. Eternity and time, we say, are two different things. The one belonging to the sphere of nature, which lasts forever, the other to that of becoming and of this universe. Now, universe is this topan. So it's not cosmos. You have this Greek word cosmos that is usually applied to denote the world. In Plotinus, the world is something much bigger than world of nature. There is a world in which this world of nature, that is planets, stars, and finally Earth and our lives, contained into. So just to note that we are talking about topan, this all. This is universe. This is translated as this all. Whereas the main aspect of this world is that it is in the becoming. It's becoming. It's coming to pass. It is there is a coming to pass and vanishing in it, or this dissolution of things. It is the world of temporality, in fact, as we shall see. We continue reading, and at once, and as if by a fairly continuous application of a concept of them, we think that we have a clear and distinct experience of them in our own souls, as we are always speaking of them and using their names on every occasion. Of course, when we try to concentrate on them and, so to speak, to get close to them, we find again that our thought runs into difficulties. Now, this is extremely important. What he says here is something you had in Heidegger, but in quite different form. Plotinus says that we when we talk of eternity and time, already have some kind of notion of what they are in ourselves. So we are never in the position that we are constructing something entirely from the outside, that we are acquiring our knowledge from some books or because somebody told us that about it. We have it in ourselves. And what the philosopher does, what a thinker in general does, is trying to sorry, to concentrate, to focus on what is already present and what is not exterior to him, and to bring it into the light. To get close to them. Furthermore, says Plotin, now we must consider that some of the blessed philosophers of ancient times, Makarion philosophon, this is genitive, plural genitive, blessed, Makarios means blessed man, Makarion philosophon, the blessed thinkers, blessed philosophers. There is a religious dimension to this in Plotinus. Of ancient times have found out the truth, but it is proper to investigate which of them have attained it most completely, and how we too could reach an understanding about these things. And first, we should inquire about eternity. What sort of thing those who make it different from time consider it to be? For when we know that which holds the position of archetype, it will perhaps become clear how it is with its image, which the philosophers say time is. But if someone, before contemplating eternity, should form a picture, that is phantasma, phantastein, that is image in his mind of what time is, it would be possible for him too to go from this world to the other by recollection and contemplate that of which time is a likeness, if time really has a likeness to eternity. Now, this is a mouthful, but this is very important. Now, if you remember, Heidegger had this idea of phenomenological fundamental of ontology of Dasein. That is that we have to investigate the human condition or the existence in which being is revealed, in which some kind of vague notion of being is already present. Now, see what Plotinus says. And then that we must commence what he calls destruction of traditional ontology. That is, to take history of philosophy and the notion of temporality in the history of philosophy and try to come to the roots, to the truth from the study of philosophical texts of antiquity and Middle Ages and some from the Renaissance and modern age, namely ending with Kant or thereabouts. Well, you see what Plotinus does. He says something apparently similar. He said we have a notion of eternity and time, and but this is important. First, we should inquire about eternity. And then we should see what the ancient philosophers had to say. Also, on the guideline, not of temporality, as in Heidegger, but eternity. And why is that, I wonder? Well, he told us already. When we know that which holds the position of archetype, it will perhaps become clear how it is with its image. Now, archetype is a form. This is because paradigma. He's a Platonist, and he considers always that form precedes the individual thing or being that is perceptible to senses, or even some intelligible beings as numbers or geometrical laws, figures, and so on. Now, what this means, but this can be applied to everything. You cannot understand the effect without knowing the cause. And you cannot start on assumption that time has no cause. There has to be a cause, and this cause, by its very nature, has to contain in it the nucleus of what time is, and to contain it in the more perfect form than it is apparent from the effect that is time itself. And then he continues, but it is also possible, before contemplating eternity, to investigate time itself, to analyze our notion of time, and to climb from that towards archetype. And this is a peculiarity of Platonism, because Platonism is not opposed to, let's say, Aristotelism, because there is this superficial notion that Plato and Aristotle were, in antiquity at least, were some kind of let's say founders of the opposite camps. No, they weren't. Maybe some camps that these philosophical schools quarreled, but it is, I think, rather well established by a scholarship of this age, and this is rather long age, until all this time until very late antiquity, beginning of dark ages, that Plato and Aristotle were not considered to be in some kind of contradiction, which is very peculiar, because a text of Aristotle we possess contain this criticism of Plato, but the problem is that we don't possess everything by Aristotle, and as Plotinus himself says in one place, we can't rely on the unwritten doctrines. And Aristotle's preserved Aristotle books were very probably notebooks he made for his lectures or his studies with his pupils. So we can be absolutely sure he's not laying out some kind of philosophical system, because especially when it comes to metaphysics, because something resembling system does not exist in metaphysics. This is a modern idea. You have in German idealism, where everybody, Hegel and others, wanted to have systems, because they thought that system is the only proper way to construct the metaphysical teaching, but it is completely the opposite. Now, this is Aristotelian way, this is Platonic way, this is for Plotinus, and this is peculiarity of Platonism. There is no contradiction between these two. This is very important. Either way, you'll get to the same thing. They are contained one in another. They are not in opposition. And this is very obvious in Plotin. Now, what is very peculiar for this method is that Plotin expects anybody who is trying to think to really think, and not merely read books and form opinions. You have to enact self-reflection, because only in self-reflection and reflection on our notions, which come from the things which are assimilated by our intellects from the beings themselves, can we be in philosophy, in contemplation, in understanding. If, on the other hand, we would only take notions, let's say from the books that seem okay to us, and then devise our volumes about some problematics as a systems, we would not come one step closer to truth than those that never tried to reflect on anything. And you have, this is my opinion, for instance, when people talk about Platonism, they don't discern. You have Platonism, for instance, of Renaissance, of Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, who always refer to Plotinus, but there is very little resemblance because they don't do this. This is an exercise in philosophy. This is completely unmediated thinking. This is why it seems so alive when you read it. It can be a little tiresome because he's very hard to translate. His Greek was never very good. He was not originally Greek speaker, and he was half blind when he wrote those essays, and he was famous for never revising what he wrote. He would just write everything in one take and leave it to poor Porphyrie to worry about it, because he was against writing down his teachings. He had his famous philosophical school in Rome, and only when he was 49 his students talked him into writing something and leave it to posterity. And these essays started to circulate in the written form somewhere in the age of Diocletianus, Roman emperor. Okay, so we should go from eternity towards time. Now, what this means? This means that if you remember in Heidegger, the question of being is a question of what the being in itself means, not being of this or that thing. And he deduces that that Dasein, this existence, have some special kind of relation to being because it is concerned about its own being. It has this meaningful relation to being. And now he wants to make analysis of Dasein in order to come to this greater being itself. And what I told in that first video is what we see here. When we take a more consequent and more important thinker than Heidegger, that is Plotinus, that the very notion of us having questions, putting these questions right here, right now, yields us an insight that we do have a notion of eternity and time. That eternity, which Heidegger rejected and considered a construct, is not a construct, but something that is congenial with the thinking that comes when you think about that there are various individual beings, but they are all being, that there is something upon which they are beings, and this is this being itself. In Plotinus, this is self-explanatory. In Heidegger also, but Heidegger makes a violent act of putting out this natural reflexive notion of eternity, of this dialectics, of this build, archetype, and its image, this relationship, which is not dialectical in sense that they are in some kind of opposition, but in the sense that one is the cause, another is effect, and that effect is contained in the cause. Because to jump forward a bit, this notion of causality, not only in Platonism, this is in all proper metaphysics, notion of causality is such that when we come on the level of spirit that is non-material, the effect, the distance between effect and cause is not measured by a spatial, temporal, or any kind of quantitative distance, but distance is only in its essence, in its essential power. So because eternity is superior to time, it is better, it is more beautiful, it is more truth, it is closer to God. After all, it makes it superior forever than its effect, which is time, as we will see. But time is at the same time contained into eternity. There is what I want to show you here is that there is no discrepancy. There is no some kind of little abyss of nothingness between them. They are not atomized. They are different but together. And this is something that Plotinus wants to bring us to see literally with our mind's eye. And many other of his essays you can really see when you read him that he's talking to you, writing this in a kind of description. He's describing something that he sees that is very very interesting, very lively, very how should I put it, very substantial, something that you will hardly find in the modern philosophy. And this is what makes him very relevant. Aristotle is very similar to him, although he is not concerned with the same problem. He is concerned with the same problems, but in a different way. He was not a mystic. He doesn't go that far in his preserved texts as Plotinus. You have this, what I want to say, you have this raw thinking in motion, that you can, in a way, assimilate to. Now he tries, we will skip his questions what eternity is not. He tries to put a few of these notions about eternity, whether it is something that is tied to notion, whether the time is eternal, so we call eternities on the ground of time, and so on. We'll just skip some of that, although it is very important, and I do encourage, if you ever have opportunity, do read this yourselves. And then we come to this, the intelligible world. Just a minute, where is this in Greek? Okay, intelligible world has it in the way in which a whole includes its parts, but eternity includes the whole all at once, not as a part, but in the sense that all things which are of such a kind as to be eternal are so by conforming to it. Just to put this in the context, which I never read, he asks whether this intelligible world, which I will explain what it is in a second, is identical with eternity. And here he says that it is not. Namely, intelligible world, for Plotin, we'll meet it again a bit down the line, is the world of, let's say, perfect non-material entities, let's call them that, non-material beings. And in Platonism that means a lot of things. That's not only the world of forms that we have from Plato's dialogues, that is forms. And I don't like this literal transliteration ideas. Ideas are not in our mind. Idea is the thing seen in ancient Greek. And these forms are archetypes, in the same sense that, as we said before, eternity is the archetype of time. They can be understood as causes, but not as causes, not necessarily as causes as we today kind of unconsciously understand causality, mechanical causes, something that moves things by pushing them. No. This is not it. Those are eternal beings. And those eternal beings and this intelligible world that is a paradigma, that is the archetype of Topan, that is this nature in which we live, the universe, has an attribute of eternity, of everlastingness. But it is not eternity itself. That is what he wants to say. Eternity is something that has to do with it, but it is not it. And he says this intelligible world has it in the way in which a whole includes its parts, but eternity includes the whole all at once, not as a part, but in the sense that all things which are of such a kind as to be eternal are so by conforming to it. So eternity has no parts. This is very important. He's trying to, on the one hand, reflect on his own notion of eternity, and we, reading him, are obliged to do that, and he's trying to test this notion on experience. But remember, this is not experience of in the sense of empiricism, what we consider today to be this philosophy based on quote-unquote experience. So he asks, is eternity perhaps the rest? Because time is something that we tie to motion. Then he says it is not rest, but because you have eternal rest and so on, and something that is at rest was maybe sometimes in the movement and so forth. And to skip a few more of the possibilities of what eternity or eternal being can be, we come to this, and I think this will be pretty explanatory. And when one looks closely into this manifold power, meaning eternity, then according as one sees it as a subject, that is Greek word hypokeimenon, as sees as a substance, as one being, a kind of substrate, one calls it substance. Then one calls it motion, according as one sees it as life. Then rest, insofar as it is always, in every way, unchangingly itself. The other and the same, in that these different realities are altogether one. Now, the thing he's talking about here is megistagene. Megistagene, or the highest or the greatest genera, is a Plato's term. It comes from Plato's dialogue Sophists, and it was very important for Platonists. Platonists, that is Plotinus and then others after him, consider this megistagene, the five determinations of what he calls nous, which is translated sometimes as intellect, or even better, spirit. Spirit is a hypostasis. Hypostasis is untranslatable in English, in my opinion, literary, but it means subsistent. It can be translated as a subsistent reality, that is, a reality that is self-sufficient, the first reality that is self-sufficient. And this hypostasis is in fact first distinction that can be conceived in God, to put it like this, in this Neoplatonic metaphysics and theology, because God is even greater than it, and he is called various names in Platonism, but the most usual is Hen, the one, or the even unique, or the only one will be the proper meaning, I think, of this. And what this this power of megistagene means is the first differentiation of when this one puts in himself, so to speak, by reflecting into himself. And this is the first, one may say, the first act of creation, although in Neoplatonism you can't really apply the word creation. It's better to say manifestation, like world manifests from the God, not that world is created by the God. Although I must stress that those people who then start to flat out reject Platonists, or flat out rejects Christian and Christian theology and so on, miss the point, because these things are very let's say diffuse. and very subtle. And this is not the kind of thinking you can put in a system. So there is a very good possibility to take this mentality and see it also as very close to Christian, and especially to some brands of Christian theology, and call this manifestation creation. There are some other things that really cannot, but this is not, I think, so much one of them. But it is very ambitious indeed that somebody would go on and try to demonstrate these determinations of Godhead. This is very very dangerous business, because, and I myself, if I can be personal, at this instance, don't like maybe not so much going too deep, but letting loose, laying off kind of discipline of intellect and go into these things, because this can get dangerous in the mental sense, in my opinion. But Plotinus was a ancient metaphysician, ancient mystics. Those are people of different mold. He was not Christian, of course, but he was rational, and rationality in mysticism, this is rational mysticism, and I would argue that there is none other mysticism than rational mysticism. But you have to be aware that rationality has much deeper meaning than we usually think. He was the man, I think, who could take a lot of punches in the intellectual and spiritual sense, so to speak. So this is, you can imagine this notion between these two hypostases as this most nous, or intellect, which is comprises these five greatest genera, as a most perfect being that can be described in language and in thought, that can be taught. But the Godhead itself, from which it springs, is so perfect that it is beyond perfection. It is hyperousias. It is above being, beyond being. Hepeke na tesousias, as Plato would say in his Republic, on the other side of being. And this is where we have this word transcendent. This means transcendere, to step over. This is it. This is this idea that there is something that is absolutely on the other side of thinking, of reality, because it is the cause of reality. It's absolutely transcendent. But always it is present, because reality is in it. Although you see in these in these Platonists, we are not even on the level of nature. They start from the level of reality of spirit, because this is description of what Plotinus considers to be spirit. And this spirit is in fact the first gaze that the one makes into himself. And this gaze is not something that we have, that we are doing, but we are in a way participating in it. I will not go too far into this, because this is another story, just to give you kind of this outline of the whole of Plotinus' philosophy, because he always expects you, when he analyzes individual problem, that you have in the background the image of the whole. And now what it means, these five determinations are substance, this is ousia, this is being. So the spirit is five things. It is being, it is in motion insofar as it is a living being, because the most perfect motion is life, and most perfect being is substance. But it is also the rest, insofar it is always unchanging, because it is perfect. It cannot become more perfect or less perfect. It is the other and the same in the same instant, because obviously motion and rest are opposites, but in it they are not opposites. They are held together in one substance, one being, that is spirit. And on the other hand, they are, and in this they are the same, because the same reflects the other. When you think the same, you think the other. When you think the other, you think the same. And this is all what? Two, three, not. This is one. This is the description of something that is one, of uniqueness. And when you think of it, when you contemplate it, it indicates to the one that you cannot conceive. This is the most you can conceive of God in Plotinus. We'll suspend any criticism or going into discussions with later theologies and so forth, but this is it. And eternity has to do with this. And he continues. So too, one puts it all together again into one, so as to be only life, compressing the otherness in these intelligible realities, and seeing the unceasingness and self-identity of their activity, and that it is never other, and is not a thinking or life that goes from one thing to another, but is always the self-same, without extension or interval. Seeing all this one, sees eternity, in seeing a life that abides in the same, and always has the all present to it, not now this and then again that, but all things at once, and not now some things and then again others, but a partless completion, and as if they were all together in a point, and had not yet begun to go out and flow into lines. It is something which abides in the same, in itself, and does not change at all, but is always in the present, because nothing of it has passed away, nor again is there anything to come into being, but that which it is, it is. Let's start from the ending. That which it is, it is. This is the definition of being. For instance, when you take Heidegger, what can you say about being, especially in later Heidegger? The being is. And this is the Plotinus says this also, but Heidegger always omits what is natural to this notion, namely that the being is eternal. And now we have here some determinations of eternity. It is not extension. It has no extent. It is a life that compresses, as he says, sublimes the otherness of the intelligible reality we just described. And it has no after and before. It has no extension. It has no interval. It is like, can be imagined like a point, like a one, and it is always the same. But no, consider that it is a life. It is very important. It is not something static, because people who superficially criticize the notion of eternity, for instance, existentialists in 20th century, they take this, and idiots that superficially criticize Platonic thinking. They are not capable, obviously, to lift their intellects into this, let's say, higher level, not some kind of higher state, mystical state, but in the state of thinking these things out from the traces that we have in our own intellects and souls as their imprints. So they are looking, for instance, at eternity as a kind of reducing time to its determinants, to taking the notion of time and emptying it of content. And the same goes with Platonism in general, when they say that this one is some kind of number, that Plotinus was thinking about one many, okay, one is the first. And then that this is something analogous to a Big Bang theory. This is complete nonsense. But and people, I saw people who write books, volumes of books, who are extremely educated, and they simply don't see this very simple fact that you cannot understand nothing of what he says without reflecting upon yourself in the moment that you are doing it. This is activity. This is a living activity. And these are living notions. You can misinterpret them. And I think Plotinus, and this is my opinion, did misinterpret a lot of things. But substantially, it is a natural activity of intellect. And it can, in some things, it can yield only one result. It cannot think, it doesn't imagine things. So this is theological logic. And when you take it, see it in the tradition of Christianity, which goes in other direction, which cannot accept a lot of Plotinus things, but accepts some, not because they needed Plotinus, they could never read, they could have never read him, but this is the logic. For instance, this cause effect, I'm talking, this image, archetype image, this relation is conditio sine qua non if you want to think of these things. Or you'll get what you get in Heidegger or Order of the Nine Angles. You will remember, who is following Kali Tribune, when we talked about Order of the Nine Angles and their concept of aion. Now you see what the aion is. Now we'll have a definition just a second. They considered aion to be something totally opposite of eternity. It is an everlasting chaos, everlasting death, everlasting non-life, something that is beyond, below matter. It's completely other thing, because they don't, they are not morally capable, in my opinion, and intellectually disciplined to come to which Plotinus or somebody following this logic comes, because Plotinus comes to very logical conclusion that everything that is has a cause, except the ultimate cause. The causality is the way, is the pathway in which things are, and it is a pathway between things that are mind by its own nature, not by its own decision, but by its own nature, reflects. First of all assimilates, and then reflects, infers upon it. And then you can come to these conclusions. Then you are able to come to them. Without this, you are not able to do anything. And you have academics, you have professors of philosophy that are utterly incapable to make these simple acts, these simple decisions of will that move the intellect, because this is activity, this is living activity, this thinking. This is not shooting shit about something, or having a breeze, having a light conversation. This is soul running itself into activity, activating itself, actualizing itself. And this is the reason, in my opinion, why, for instance, when you think in this way, when you have this kind of approach, the conclusions you get from this, you never forget. For instance, when I finish this, and if I don't read Plotin for 2 years, I will forget a lot of these from this treatise. Not a lot, because it is very difficult and you remember it because of the effort you have to invest. But what I won't forget is his notion of eternity and time. partly also because I have that notion in myself. I'll leave open to discussion whether he got it right or not, but he got to it. He put himself and myself as his reader in the position to look at it. Whereas a lot of philosophers, or folk philosophers, or charlatans even, will not get you there, even if they write huge books. Plotin never wrote huge books himself. Now let's see how he defines eternity. That then which was not and will not be, but is only, which has being, which is static, by not changing to the will be, nor ever having changed, this is eternity. The life then which belongs to that which exists and is in being, altogether and full, completely without extension or interval, is that which we are looking for, eternity. Now this is eternity. It is the unity, the one from which springs some springs some things. We are not. It is very important to remember. We are not on the level of perceivable world with this. What Plotin says. He's talking about the life of the nous, a life of spirit, of intellect, of the principle, of the metaphysical principle of spirit. This is eternity. Eternity is its life. Eternity is what brings it together and at the same time differentiate it in active sense as this five megistagene, the greatest genera, that is substance, motion, rest, other, same. This is eternity is a principle of discernment. It is a medium in which it is discerned like this, and at the same instance unified. This is eternity. And now, as we have eternity, he'll talk a bit more about it. He can go down to the interpretation of time. Okay, we'll skip. I was meaning to go some more into what he means by this, but we are already nearing an hour. And this is the only thing, the only realm of being which is always existing. Okay, this is eternity. Now he is going towards time, and we'll have to cut this a bit short. Now look at what he does. So then, we must go down from eternity to the inquiry into time, and to time, for there our way leads us upwards, but now we must come down in our discourse, not altogether, but in the way in which time comes down. Now if the blessed man of ancient times had said nothing about time, we should have to take eternity as our starting point and link up our subsequent account of time with it, starting what we think about it and trying to make the opinion we express accord with the interior awareness of time which we have. Now see the method. He starts from up and then goes down, following the thing he's thinking out, following the notion and following the thing, because between the notion and the thing, in the very essence of reality, there is no difference. Notion is a construct in our, what they call phantasm, in our mind. but in essence, in its matrix, in which through which it comes into our thinking, it is not separated from the real thing. There is no separation between subject and object, and therefore he can, and you see from his way of speaking, he's following time as it proceeds from the eternity, from its cause. And we must reflect on our notion time similarly as it proceeds, flows from the notion of eternity, and always, in a sense, remains in it. And now there is a long discussion on time here of three historical notions of time, one of them being important, Aristotle's notion of time. And this is this one. Is it a number of movement or measure? Arithmos dekineseos emetron, that is the number of movement, or the numbering of movement, or its measure, because in Aristotle's view time is a measure of movement, or the number of movement towards before and after, and he criticizes this notion, but comes from it to a conclusion what the time is. Unfortunately, we have no time and still less eternity to go into all this, although the best thing would be to go through whole text sentence by sentence. But and now how this is very interesting, the way how he comes to the definition on time. He kind of took all those ancient notions of time consideration, find some truth in that, find something wrong in them or unclear, and then he starts. Let's quote. We must take ourselves back to the disposition which we said existed in eternity. Remember, always remain in the cause when you think. To that quiet life, all a single whole, still unbounded, altogether without declination, resting in and directed towards eternity. Time did not yet exist, not at any rate for the beings of that world. We shall produce time by means of the form and nature of what comes after. If then these beings were at rest and in themselves, one could hardly perhaps call on the Muses, who did not then yet exist, to tell us how time first came out. But one might perhaps, even if the Muses did exist then after all, ask time, when it has come into being, to tell us how it did come into being and appear. It might say something like this about itself, that before, when it had not yet, in fact, produced this before, or felt the need of the after, it was at rest with eternity in a real being. It was not yet time, but it itself too kept quiet in that. But since there was a restlessly active nature which wanted to control itself and be on its own, and chose to seek for more than its present state, this moved, and time moved with it. And so always moving on to the next and the after, and what is not the same, but one thing and after another, we made a long stretch of our journey, and constructed time as an image of eternity. This is, well, I won't comment on the poetical value of this, but decide for yourself. Oh, and what he said here is, he takes you back, he takes himself back in the notion of eternity, and lets the notion of time practically zip from it. Now what is important here is that he understands something that you will find later in medieval metaphysics, in Christian theologians who would not be very well disposed. They liked Plotinus, most of them, but who could, at time when they could lay hands on his philosophisms from the second-hand sources. what is important, what they all share, is this notion that you have to start from the upwards. When you take, for instance, Summa Contra Gentiles by Thomas Aquinas, it starts with God, then creation, then providence. It starts from the first, and then it proceeds to the last, not the other way around. What Heidegger does is that he takes existence that is completely undifferentiated contingency, something that has nothing, something that has nothing in the midst of it, because it is a not kind of nothingness that reflects into itself, this Dasein of his. And he tries from this to come to something like this. Well, tough luck, Heidegger, because it will never work. And it is a kind of metaphysics in the reverse that goes below, that tries to dig below, because there is no above. He denies the existence of this, or the procedure that Plotinus here applies. And this, in this poetic passage, philosophically poetic, and imaginative, he describes the coming to pass of time. Time is an image of eternity, and he uses the Plato's definition. Time is a moving image of eternity. But what it is in itself, this nature that started to move in this perfect being, in this perfect gaze of God in itself, was the soul. And this time, to cut this long story short, is the life of soul, as the eternity could be called life of spirit, of the life of this real being, let's say the first kind of particulars to God, to ineffable God himself. The soul would be the image of this, the moving image of this, the being that is that kind of fell from this. And this is Platonic notion of first original sin that is radically different than Christian, but has this structure that seems same in some way, because it is the reason why the world came to be as it is now, is the what they call tolma, the audacity of soul, the wish of the principle, the intent, better to say, of a principle that was in eternity of God, to be isolated, to be for itself, to create. And it cannot create, because only God creates. Although in Platonism we still cannot speak on about creation in the Christian sense. It's more like, as I've already said, a manifestation, because this is kind of spontaneous, but not in a sense of pantheism that is some kind of spontaneous process. No, because God in metaphysics, in any true metaphysics, when you rise to these principles, you can say that maybe this is going too far, or maybe that this is not right, but all of those principles had to be understood as alive, as intelligent, as powerful, to cause everything that is below them to have a power. It is hierarchical world of metaphysics. So this is congenial maybe to from in Plotinus or some later theologians and metaphysicians. But what I wanted to say, that his idea of the fall of the soul, because it is the fall of eternity, is that it creates time with its fall, because time is its life. It is where in eternity everything is together. With soul, everything is in continuity of before and after. And it has to think continuously, it has to think in sequence. And we, as living souls, have to think in sequences, in inferences, one thing after another. Whereas in the spirit, it is it is all together at one instance. And whether his human being is capable for this kind of thinking. This intellectual gaze is a discutable thing. For Plotinus, human is capable, but it has to be bestowed upon him from on high. This is not something that one can kind of by his own will produce, because human being is not soul. This soul is something much greater than human being initially in Plotinus, something much something prior to human being. But human has the trace of this in himself and can be bestowed with the gift of participating in the life of spirit. And this is something that is, let's say, arguable. We'll leave this, of course, for maybe one day discussion. Now, this soul, what is soul, is very, very important to understand. The soul is the active principle of the body, not in the sense that it comes from the body, but it is the principle that gives body a form. Not only body, but the physical things, the beings that can be perceived by senses. The soul is what makes them, actualizes them, makes them what they are. This is soul. So you have this also after Plotinus. You have this, for instance, in Thomas Aquinas, when he says the world is in the soul, for instance, or the soul is not in in man, but man is in the soul, because this is not spatial relation. This is a relation of perfection. This is a relation of cause and effect, of principle, and what is subordinated to it, what flows from it. This is the relation of the source and the flow. And this is why. And soul, what he means by soul here is what intelligibility, I would say, of the universe, topan, of the nature, visible nature, is soul in a primary sense. This is not thinking soul in a sense we think and so forth, and human soul is something else. It is intellectual soul. This is whole different ball game, because he's here talking about principles. But note that these principles kind of tie everything together in continuous whole, in continuous unity that is without any cracks in it, atoms, void, and so forth. This is because, of course, we are here still not on the level of visible universe. This is where it begins. And of course, I'm talking in temporal sequence because I'm temporal being, but I'm not talking about temporal things. And this is a human predicament where we have to fight and try to give words, disciplined discourse about this, which is very, very hard, and can never be a closed system, because we are talking about something that is very much greater than us. So, time is the life of the soul. And this is the relation of eternity and time. I skipped a lot, as you can see, and we are already more than an hour in, but unfortunately couldn't do this in a less time. Eternity doesn't serve me so good. I will conclude with reiterating why I did this video in relation to what I did with Heidegger, because we had even some discussion on Kali Tribune on Heidegger, very interesting, and a point was made that Heidegger reawakened this question of being, and that this is a valid point, although this is illusion. This is something I thought also about Heidegger, and Heidegger is rising in popularity again, especially on the fringes, on these ugly fringes of intellectual global world we on Kali Tribune follow. As you probably know. And the reason was to demonstrate that this is how question of being looks like, and not what Heidegger does. What Heidegger does is something that is kind of inverted image of this. it is extremely similar in its essential structure, because if you read later Heidegger, he used this poetic language where he tries to force the things to speak. Oh my God, and that doesn't look pretty. And what Plotinus does, and this is something that Heidegger called in his early philosophy, called the phenomenological approach. And in video we were talking about Heidegger's phenomenology of being and time, and later on he called it a historical thinking or thinking of being and so on. And the real instance of such immediate, let's say, reflection of being in the language, this is it. This passage that seemed a bit of poetical, but in Plotinus, this poetry of thought is never deprived of intelligible rational structure. You can always understand it. Plotinus is a difficult thinker, but you can always understand Plotinus. Heidegger, you can't understand. He doesn't want you to understand. He wants you to break your thinking against the barrier of nothingness. And those are his calls for a heroic existence, some such things. This is in Heidegger and in these modern anti-metaphysicians like him. But he is, interestingly enough, kind of never had anybody to continue what he started and to make the chaos he was sinking in more profound. I think somebody like Alexander Dugin could have this ambition, but I don't think he's really Heidegger material. Heidegger was extremely proficient in philosophy. I think Dugin is not, because Dugin is not focused like Heidegger. Heidegger was 100% focused on a life of pure thought, directed downwards. While you have, for instance, Plotinus, who is directed upwards. And what I wanted to demonstrate, I hope it was acceptable to you watching this, is that this is metaphysics. This is posing of question of being. There are a lot of things. I am very uneasy with Platonists and so on, but it doesn't matter, because the way in philosophy, there is only one door to philosophy and to thinking, and if you decide to make philosophy your path of life, because you don't have to do that in order to come to something that is to fulfill the purpose of human life. But if you want, you cannot skip this. You can skip Plotinus, but you cannot skip the ability to take what you have in yourself and let yourself see that it reflects that which is not in yourself, which is outside, which is bigger than you. And then in this, put yourself in this process of thinking, of being in the world in the right sense, not in the Heideggerian sense, but in the sense that you realize that you have a soul and you have an intellect, and that they have a certain nature, and to understand something, that you have to assimilate it with your intellect, not talk about it, not think about it. You have to think it, and then only then you can go into constructing inferences, into critique, into I don't know, into investigating. And this is something I wanted to make kind of visible in this reading of Plotin. I hope it was successful. It was a bit long-winded, but anybody who can suffer 15 minutes of me talking about philosophy in this way can probably suffer hour more, because he's a very patient man by the very virtue of this fact. So, thank you for attention. This was Branko Malic from Kali Tribune, and my thanks to all those that support Kali Tribune from now and then. Some of them continuously. You know who you are. I won't say names because some people don't like to be named in public. Thank you very much, and you really make this possible for me. This is Branko Malic signing out.